Insight Podcast.
Welcome to our second podcast of the Insight Software Budgeting Podcast Series. I'm Heather McNeil, and today I'm joined with John Lovar and John Hilborn, our in-house budgeting gurus who will help us understand current budgeting scenarios and ways to improve that process. John Lovar has 15 years of experience in accounting, finance, and technology. He's worked as a project specialist at insightsoftware.com, a CPA at Ernst & Young, and as a manager of financial reporting at a multi-billion-dollar organization. John Hilborn has 6 years of experience in accounting, finance, and technology. His experience includes working as a project specialist at insightsoftware.com, a CPA at KPMG, and as a manager of financial reporting at a multi-billion-dollar organization. Both John Lovar and John Hilborn have similar backgrounds. Both individuals were former end users of J.D. Edwards as well as Insight Software. This unique experience lends itself well to our team, as they both can easily identify with the struggles our customers face. Today's podcast is titled, How to Reduce Your Budgeting Cycle by 70%. What is the typical workflow for a budgeting cycle, John?
Well, typically most organizations, budgeting and forecasting is done primarily in Excel. So usually there's some situation that sounds probably familiar to this. There's usually an individual or sort of a team in finance that creates different workbooks that are sent out to various departments where they populate their budget, send back the information. The finance team consolidates the information and gives it to management to review. Management looks at it, usually says something like, take it down $1 million or change this, change that. So it comes back to finance, they resend out the forms, and the whole process goes over and over like that. So for the most part, using Excel is the best option for people, or they think it's the best option because it's the most familiar, it's the most flexible, etc. But a lot of pain points come as far as consolidations, version control, and just the whole workflow around the monthly forecast or the annual budget.
All right. So you described a little bit about that process. So as the budget goes to all the different departments, how are the budget contributors and approvers notified of the changes in a typical budgeting process?
Well, usually with Excel, they'll send a Excel workbook to XYZ department head, and they'll fill out their budget, and usually their manager would approve it or what have you, and they send it back. And say they send it into finance, and then after they send it, they maybe want to change something, and they'll let finance know. So you show up to the meeting, and the numbers changed. And obviously, this may not be the exact case in every situation, but version control is usually a typical pain point when doing any kind of forecasting or budgeting in Excel.
Yeah, I would add from my own personal experience, I can recall, I used to be a manager of financial planning myself, and I would send out a whole bunch of different worksheets, and then I would go gather those back in. And when they came back in, everything looked great, and I would go ahead and finish the process, do all my consolidations, and upload it into J.D. Edwards again. Now, the problem would only rise to the top until I finished the process and I would find out that somebody added a new account to that spreadsheet, or revised a calculation somewhere, or accidentally pasted over a formula. And once again, things didn't reconcile. So there are many different issues related to this whole spreadsheet madness issue.
So is there any way to improve the communication process between the departments?
I don't know. With spreadsheets, it's always a difficult challenge. I think the only communication that you have is either the phone or email. You can put controls in place with worksheets and workbooks where you don't allow them to make any changes, but that sort of restricts what they can and can't do. And oftentimes they end up doing all these side spreadsheets and putting the data over there. And so you have all these different iterations going on, and all the support is scattered throughout the organization. So there are tools, I think, that you can look at today that help manage workflow, Insight being one of them.
Yeah, I think Excel is a great tool, obviously, and you're never going to be able to take Excel away from any accountant. But it's not, it's meant for calculations, the modeling, the flexibility of it, but it's not a financial reporting tool, and it's not a tool meant to be used for consolidations.
Right.
And I think anyone can agree with that.
So here's a question for you. Say that you're finished now and you've finally all decided that this is the budget that you're going to go with and it's still in a spreadsheet format. If you do want to put that information back into J.D. Edwards, how do you do that with this spreadsheet process?
Yeah, usually the poor soul in finance has to consolidate all the Excel workbooks and create some sort of upload template that they use to manually upload back into J.D. Edwards. And typically, from my experience, that's a cumbersome process, and usually, you don't format something correctly, or you forget one account and you have to redo it all.
Yeah, and nobody really feels sorry for that guy except for the poor soul himself.
Exactly.
All right. So we started this off by saying that, we're going to show you how to reduce your budgeting cycle by 70%, which is a pretty big claim. Do you have any customers that have benefited from this solution that you can talk about?
Yeah, absolutely. As I get into it, it'll make a little more sense. But I think that the key point being within the workflow built into Insight is just the ability to consolidate the information very easily and keep track of sort of who's input and who hasn't input. Just really run the whole budget cycle, much easier, as opposed to trying to keep track of all these different emails and workbooks.
I think it's important to realize, we're not going into it in this particular podcast, but the ability to key directly into the custom ledger as opposed to these different spreadsheets, it eliminates all of that spreadsheet shuffling that's going on. So that in and of itself saves quite a bit of time.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, why don't you show me some of your magic here?
Okay, thanks, Heather. So I'm logged in here as a Budgeting Lite user. And what our Budgeting Lite user is, it's someone who needs to be involved in the budget process from an input perspective. So it might be someone who's a department head or a manager of XYZ business units. And essentially, this person would probably in the past get an Excel workbook, or better yet, it's someone who needs to be involved in the budget. But even before, it was too much of a pain to get them to, usually their accountant would do their budgeting part from an Excel spreadsheet. So they, right in the field, can actually have a Budgeting Lite license and the closest to information so they can be involved.
Yeah, that's one of the trends that we're starting to see, right? Corporate has been typically responsible for assembling budget information, and they're doing it locally, and they're going out and maybe they're picking up the phone and asking for input, but they're not getting direct input from the field. And so now what you can enable are those people with Bud Light, their access point through this version of Insight to be able to participate directly in budgeting.
Exactly. So you have to kind of use your imagination here a little bit. But basically what we've done here is created a form. So someone in finance or the team in finance that's controlling the whole annual budget, they would create a form similar to this or whatever version or variation of this you would have for your organization. And they would publish this out to the Budgeting Lite user. So right now I come in here and as the Budgeting Lite user, and I could go to this cycle status button. And if I click on this, it says I'm logged in here. And I can see the different forms I'm responsible for and the status of those forms. So this is, you may have multiple forms. You may have, if I'm logged in as a manager, I could have the multiple people that I'm responsible for. So the point being is the end user comes into this form and they hit enter budget mode. And you can see the cells that are going to turn yellow, the ones that they're responsible to account for. And you can set this up any which way you want. You can have it so XYZ accounts you're not allowed to budget to. You can have this kind of as bureaucratic as you want or as sort of free-flowing as you want. But basically, they come in here, and you may say copy this whole column over and paste it in, and this is your kind of where you start your budget. So you can see this form. This column's pulling last year's actuals. This is our suggested uplifts, and this is the column they're actually budgeting to. Or they could come in here and actually key directly, so you can put in a number. Or you could have, in this situation, I just have 3 accounts, but I could have the whole column open up. The point being is after I've entered my numbers into this information or into these columns, I exit enter budget mode, and it saves it to that custom ledger within Insight. So now it's saved to this ledger, and back at corporate, someone can review this automatically.
I always like to point out in this particular part of the demonstration that if you go back to what we were saying, how you can employ new people in your process for budgeting and forecasting, those people have never been involved before. So if you put yourself in their shoes, what do they need to know in order to participate? And it's just as easy as launching this Budgeting Lite and then opening the form. Hitting that open form will tell them what form they're supposed to use. Then all they have to do is enter budget. The cells turn yellow so they know what they're responsible for entering into. And they just deselect that enter budget and they're done.
So here's a question. If you're a budgeting manager and, John just entered in the budget that he wanted to enter, what if the budgeting manager says, nope, you know what, that's not right? How do you handle that kind of a situation?
That's a good question. So what I've done is I've just, say I'm the end user here and I input all my months and I put in my budget. And when I'm done with this form, I would hit this finalize button.
Okay.
And what this does is it locks down the data. So now I can't change it. So now you don't have that version control problem where you send a workbook by email and then you change something later. So this is locked down. And basically what happens here is it gets pushed up to whoever the manager is in the approval process. And you kind of customize that as you roll out the budgeting tool. But basically you could that might go directly to finance, or it might get pushed up to maybe their manager.
But it's an automatic notification that actually gets launched.
Yes, absolutely. So if I go back into the cycle status button, now you can see that I finalized this form and I still need to do work on this one. But what I'm going to do now is I'm actually going to log into the same form, but from a manager's perspective.
Oh, okay. So you can see the change, and then you can make any changes that you'd like. Okay.
Exactly. So right now I'm going to log over to, and this would be probably the finance user or the manager who's going to review that form. So
okay.
If I come up to the same button here, cycle status, and you can see there's kind of a lot more going on here. But I can go in here, and I'm logged in here, and I can see the different individuals that report to me, and I can see the status of the forms. So this is the one that was just finalized here. So I can come in here, and I can open up this form, and I can review it. And if I'm happy with it, I can hit approve. Or if I wasn't happy with it, I could hit reject and put in some comments, and it would kick back to the individual for them to make a change.
Our proper workflow or best practice recommendation is that each one of the users you see in this cycle status view has a specific role or responsibility. So at the very beginning, this Bud Light user is responsible for entering in the budget numbers, and then the managers are responsible for approving and rejecting. And in an ideal world, you wouldn't necessarily allow your managers to overwrite the Bud Light user entry, because you don't want somebody during the year to come back and say, hey, you changed my number and I didn't know that. So what we can do is actually enforce a real good, proper workflow if you choose to, or we can actually empower your managers to override and make changes. It's completely up to you, but there is a solid workflow mechanism in place here.
Yeah, and that goes in kind of when we roll this out, and it kind of depends. A lot of that's cultural within an organization, and just kind of depends. We can, customize this to that environment. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to hit approve here, assuming that we're happy with this form. So I hit approve, and now I can filter this. I can go over here, and I can actually see that this is approved. And if I wanted, I could come up here and I could look at all the different forms that are approved, or all the ones that are not submitted yet, so I can call those people or send those people an email saying you got to finish your budgets. The point being is after the form is approved, I would come over here, and if I was doing this myself, I'd probably wait till they're all approved, but you could do it piecemeal if you wanted. But after the form's approved, you can come up to this upload forms button here, and with a single click, I come in here, and this is basically showing me that this form is using that BC ledger within Insight. So that's a custom ledger in Insight where the budget data is being stored, and it's ultimately going to get pushed to the JD Edwards BA ledger. And if I wanted to, I could see a little preview of the information that's going to go up to JD Edwards. So that whole upload process, which if you're doing in Excel right now is somewhat cumbersome, we basically take that away. So I would just hit OK here, and it would go right up to JD Edwards.
Yeah, this is where we can come back to that. We save 70% of your budgeting time. A lot of time during a budget cycle is spent just getting from those Excel spreadsheets into JD Edwards. And here, with just a simple point and click, we automatically upload right into JD Edwards. So that is a huge, tremendous time saving in and of itself. There is validation that's going on through this entire process so that when you do go to upload, there are no issues.
So out of this workflow process, do you think that piece, the uploading to JD Edwards piece, is what you hear the most comments back from your customers, or do you hear it on other pieces of the workflow?
I think it kind of depends. I mean, that was a big one. I think across the board, there's always someone's having to do that if you're putting the information back into JD Edwards. And, obviously certain organizations that may be smoother or maybe more of a pain point. But just the whole controlling the whole budget in general.
I think a lot of people would probably be surprised if they went out and actually asked whoever's responsible for the upload how long it takes them to do. Because that's just someone kind of in the corner of some office doing it on their own, spending a day to maybe sometimes a week or two uploading. And, people in organizations don't realize that. But it can be a tremendous amount of time and cost saved with this process here.
Got it. Perfect. Well, thank you so much for illustrating how to reduce your budgeting cycle by 70%. Signing off today, Heather McNeil, John Lovar, and John Hilborn. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
This concludes the podcast. Please stay tuned to the follow-up sessions. And to learn more, visit insightsoftware.com/budgeting.